Owls in the Family, Chapter 8, Part 2. I thought this was a really cool picture with the owl fluffing out his feathers in the front there. It almost looks fake, doesn't it? Okay, last time I asked you the question, what would you like about being a kid a long time ago and what would you not like? So a whole bunch of you had different answers. A lot of you said you would really like the exploring time and the free time outside. And a lot of you said you weren't quite sure about not having your parents around to look after you if something happened. So that seemed to be the same for a lot of people. Now, I didn't live as long ago as the author, and it was 1961, by the way, not 1951. I made that mistake last time, but it was 1961. But here I am, right here in the 1970s, and it is wintertime in Manitoba. And these are my fabulous toys that I got to take outside to play with. An ice cream bucket and a big spoon from my mom's kitchen. And my brother and I spent hours and hours and hours and hours outside digging and building and making snow forts and all kinds of things. And this is a picture of my brother and me. And this is a very tall snowbank. Now, when it would snow on our farmyard, our neighbor would come in and he had a big snow plow in the front and he would take all that snow and plow it up in a big pile. So we had like a little hill and then we would make sort of a slide to go down on it. Now, I couldn't find any summer pictures, but one thing I really enjoyed about being a kid and one of my favorite memories is we would go over to our neighbor's house and we would go crayfish hunting. And so my neighbors had a girl and a boy the same age as me and my brother. So it would be 2 girls and 2 boys. And we were like 10 or 12 years old. And we would get our ice cream buckets and we would walk about a mile down the road. And there was a little ditch. And that ditch always had water in it. And the crayfish used to live in there, wild. And it does look like a little tiny lobster. This crayfish would be only about as big, maybe as the palm of your hand. And we used to catch them and then we'd put a little water in the ice cream bucket and we'd sort of look at them for a few days. And then when we got sick of them, we'd take them back down to the ditch and we'd release them and let them go. Except for this one time, my brother and I brought them home in a bucket and we dumped them at the front door and they got pushed behind a closet of clothes and we forgot about them. And all of a sudden, a few weeks later, my mom just screamed because she had gone in the closet looking for something and she touched the bucket and this, I guess, made all the crayfish move. And there was no water left in the bucket, just the crayfish. And they made this sort of clacking sound and she was not expecting to find creatures in there. So anyways, that was unfortunate for my mom that she found them. But I really enjoyed doing that when I was a kid as well. On the other hand, I remember a few times being bullied as a kid and I never even thought about telling anybody or telling my mom or anything like that. We just sort of had to put up with it and deal with it. And it would have been nice to have some parent help with that for sure. So I agree with you guys. The exploring part was great, but not having your parents there when you need them or feeling that you could tell them about stuff was definitely not a positive part. We'd had a good laugh at Wool, but he'd had the laugh on us before the day was done. After we had eaten, we decided to go down to the riverbank and wait for the sun to set. A pair of coyotes lived on the opposite bank of the river, and every evening just at sunset, one of them would climb a little hill and sit there howling. It was a scary sound, but we liked it because it made us feel that this was the olden times, and the prairie belonged to us, to the buffalo, and the Indians. Remember who they're talking about. They're talking about First Nations people. And to the prairie wolves. And another name for a prairie wolf is a coyote. So they're not actually talking about wolves there. They're talking about coyotes. Wool was sitting in the hanging tree, and Rex and Mutt had gone off somewhere on a hunting trip of their own. It was growing dusk when we heard a lot of crashing in the trees behind us. We turned around just as two big kids came into sight. They were two of the toughest kids in Saskatoon. If they hadn't come on us so suddenly, we would have been running before they even saw us. But now it was too late to run. They would have caught us before we could go 10 feet. The only thing we could do was sit where we were and hope they would leave us alone. What a hope that was! They came right over, and one of them reached down and grabbed Bruce and started to twist his arm behind his back. "Listen, you little rats," he said. "We heard you got a cave someplace down here. You're too young to own a cave, so we are taking over. Show us where it is, or I'll twist your arm right off." The other big kid made a grab for me, but I slipped past him and was just starting to run when he stuck his foot out and tripped me. Then he sat on me. "Say, Joe," he said to his pal, "I got an idea. Either these kids tell us where the cave is, or we tie 'em to old hanging tree and leave 'em there all night with the Injun's ghost." Just then, the coyote across the river gave a howl. All four of us jumped a little, what with the talk of ghosts. But Joe said, "That ain't nothing, just a coyote howling. You gonna tell us, kid, or do we tie you to the tree?" Bruce and I knew they were only trying to scare us, but we were scared all right. I was just opening my mouth to tell them where the cave was when Wool took a hand in things. He had been sitting on the big limb of the hanging tree, and since it was almost dark by then, he looked like a big white blob up there. Remember what we talked about before about the underside of owls being white and what that looks like. I don't think he'd been paying much attention to what was happening on the ground below him, but when that coyote howled, he must have thought it was some kind of challenge. He opened his beak and gave the owl hunting scream. Did you ever hear a horned owl scream? Usually they do it at night to scare any mice or rabbits that happen to be hiding near into jumping or running. Then the owl swoops down and grabs them. If you've ever heard an owl scream, you'll know it's just about the most scary sound in all the world. When Wool cut loose, it made even my skin creep, and I knew what it was, but the two big kids didn't know. So you can see what's going to happen here. Here's the two bullies, and here's Billy and Bruce. There's Wool up there. Their heads jerked up and they saw the ghostly white shape that was Wool up there in the hanging tree. And then they were off and running. They went right through the poplar woods like a couple of charging buffaloes, and we could still hear them breaking bush when they were half a mile away. My guess is they ran all the way to Saskatoon. When they were out of hearing, Bruce stood up and began rubbing his arm. Then he looked at Wool. "Boy," he said, "you sure scared those two roughnecks silly. But did you have to scare me right out of my skin too?" "Woo-hoo, woo-hoo-hoo," Wool chuckled as he floated down out of the tree and lit upon my shoulder. Now, we've read a lot of really silly, funny, weird kind of stuff in this book, and we're just going to have a little chat about fiction and nonfiction. So I want you to just think for a minute, is this book a fiction or nonfiction book? Okay, so what is a fiction book? A fiction book tells a story. And we were talking about nonfiction, all different types of nonfiction. And nonfiction has facts. There's no story, except there is a type of nonfiction called biography. Oops. Okay, so what is a biography? Well, we could have the biography of Albert Einstein. We could have the biography of Bill Gates. We could have the biography of Helen Keller. So a biography is all the true events of a person's life. You could write your own biography, right? So true events of a person's life. Now, when Farley Mowat was a child, he lived in Saskatoon. So that part is true. And he did have a lot of pets. So that part is true. So is this fiction or nonfiction? Well, I'm going to say that it is called biographical fiction. So it is still fiction, but it uses parts of his life. So some things in the book are true that really happened to him as a child. Some things are kind of made up to make the story really good, because the story of the whole book has to be a good story. So here is your little job for today. Write F for fiction or NF for nonfiction beside each of these events in the story. Now, this is going to be your opinion. There's no way to look this up. There's no use asking your mom or dad about it. And even I don't know what some of these things are. I have a pretty good guess, but Farley Mowat never tells us exactly which things were true and exactly which things weren't true. We just know that he did certain things, that he lived in Saskatoon, and that he had a lot of pets, and he loved animals over his whole lifetime. So what you would do in the comment box underneath this on Fresh Grade is you would put a 1, a 2, and a 3. And now you'll take a look at number 1. There is a pet parade. So do you think that's reasonable that do you think that could have happened? That a town would have had a pet parade for all the kids to dress up their pets, and that Billy and Bruce and Murray would have collected their pets, their tame ones and their wild ones, and made up a entry to go in the parade like that. And maybe there could have been a snake, and maybe the parade would have been disrupted because of animals getting loose and so on and so forth. So if you think that really could have happened to him as a boy, you're going to put, actually, I'm going to get you to do true or, let's see here, false, true or false. Let's do that instead. So if you think that could have happened, put T for true. If you think that there's no way that a town would have had a pet parade or whatever, you can put false. So sorry about this, boys and girls. I was thinking about something else when I was doing that, and I don't want to go back and redo this whole video. So we're going to do this. Write true or false. Okay. All right. So whatever you think it is, you're going to write that. You're going to write that beside number 1. Okay. Number 2, parents would let their kid have a lot of wild animals as pets. So think about all the animals that Billy's mom and dad let him have, not in the house, but in the backyard. Gophers, rats, garter snakes, mice, the owls. He also had a dog. So think about that, write true or false beside number 2. And then also think about number 3. Wool would feel embarrassed. So we talked about this before. Animals can have feelings, but what kind of feelings can they have? Remember what happened to Wool in the first part of this chapter. They laughed at him so much when he was doing different things that they were dying laughing on the ground, and then Wool got embarrassed and stomped off into his cage. So think about that. Do you think that could have really happened, that an owl would react that way, and put in true or false? Okay, so make sure you have a number 1, 2, or 3 and a T or an F beside those. All right, looking forward to seeing those ideas.